Hello, and thank you very much for tuning in to the podcast series by the New Silk Road Project. I'm your host today, Charles Stevens, the founder of the New Silk Road Project. This series is dedicated to understanding and raising awareness of one of the most important development strategies of the 21st century, China's Belt and Road Initiative. The centerpiece of the New Silk Road Project, an initiative supported by Jeep, CSIS, Magellan Capital, the University of St Andrews and Shira, was to travel the course of the Silk Road economic belt from London to Yiwu in eastern China, interviewing the key actors and academics along its course. We will have to apologise in advance for some of the tangential moments in this podcast series, and also the variable quality of audio footage. We do hope this series sheds important light into China's growing global presence and the significant changes taking place across Eurasia. Some of the most beautiful driving we encountered, not just in Europe, but across Eurasia, was going through the Carpathian Mountains towards Hungary. Here we spoke to Anastas Vangeli, a doctoral researcher at the Polish Academy of Science. He told us about China's growing presence in the CEE region and how this also interacts with Russian pre-existing influence in a nice parallel to Russian involvement in Central Asia.
I've been following the Belt and Road and 16+1 ever since the inception of these initiatives. And so I was a student of Chinese politics and foreign policy in Beijing, 2011-2013. And back then I was focusing mostly on the transformation of the Communist Party. But ever since my first trip to China, I was always looking on ways to bring together my knowledge of Central East Europe, post-socialist Europe, and China. Because, my background is I studied at this university here. Back in the day, I didn't focus on China. Back at that time, I was focusing on the region itself. So anyway, 16+1 was a great opportunity. So around 2011 even, there were some meetings. The platform as such didn't exist back then, but there were some meetings, and that, of course, attracted my attention. And then there was the summit in 2012, and I was in Beijing at the time, so I could follow and talk to people ever since the beginning. And this was also the time when people started talking about China's reaction to the American pivot to the Pacific and the reorientation towards Central Asia and the New Silk Road, as it was known back then. So it came naturally. I was at the right place at the right time when this debate started, so I had the privilege to follow from the onset.
And how do the perceptions and general public awareness of both 16+1 differ from CEE region to China?
You mean how the respective publics?
Yeah, both on the political level, but also on an academic level.
Okay, so in China, it became a really important topic, I would say, from the beginning. 16+1 less so, but Belt and Road for sure. It kind of redefined Chinese academia. There was a professor talking about just the sheer volume of articles that are being produced on Belt and Road in China. So basically, she mentioned a number of thousands, maybe. I would lie to you, but it's some staggering number of articles that's being produced. This was only in the first 4 years of the initiative or something. So in China, there has been a lot of output on that. It's very much one of the key topics of the academic debate, of the policy debates as well. It's slowly become important in Europe as well, in Central Europe. Though I would say much less than in China. Of course, you cannot compare the two. And there has been lately more and more interest coming from Western media, and I think that also influences the debate here in the context of this kind of Chinese influence paradigms. So once the New York Times starts talking about it, once the Financial Times started talking about it, it becomes a cool topic. So there has been an influx also in at least among media and think tankers. Scholars, still not so much. If you see there's the main publications of 16+1 are still predominantly coming from think tanks, less so from scholars. I myself tried to fix that, so I started publishing in journals, and I've been part of some projects that are more academic in nature. That's.
And how would you distinguish between 16+1 and BRI? Because often in the mainstream press, specifically in Budapest and Hungary, these two things are merged.
Yeah, well, I don't think it's necessarily a mistake to merge them, because the way they merged in China themselves are very much kind of complementary, if not very closely related. In my work, I describe 16+1 as both a lag and a laboratory of the Belt and Road, and for the Belt and Road. 16+1 was first to be officially established in 2012, formally, with the meeting in Warsaw. Belt and Road was later on, but it doesn't matter, with China is like that, it's a lot of the initiatives are kind of experimental, and one of my hypotheses is that 16+1 was one of the laboratories. It was not the sole purpose, nor 16+1 was the sole laboratory, but part of the point of starting this mechanism was to see how these new forms of cooperation can be developed and how countries will react to them, and how can you bring that to a broader level.
And on that basis, do you not see that 16+1 was an opportunity missed? Because looking at the level of investments within the Visegrad group or the CE region, there's a lot of fluff around it.
Yeah, well, it's all about the framing, right? I know the voices who say it's an opportunity missed, and I completely agree that if you expect China to bring about huge investments, so far it hasn't lived up to the expectations. But I think we first have to see where was China as a player in the region 5 years, 6 years ago, where it is now. And I think the comparison is, self-evident. The number of meetings, the number of people going to China, the number of Chinese coming here, Chinese language being studied in the region, the regional languages being studied in China, that kind of stuff is completely unprecedented. And it's interesting, if you see what the Chinese foreign ministry considers as success. If you go through their, let's say, list of milestones achieved, they list primarily this kind of exchanges, this kind of interaction, and economic cooperation comes as something that is probably to follow suit. Of course, this can be used by the Chinese as a excuse, but in my opinion, I think that so far it's still setting the stage and still learning about the region learning about China, and trying to basically set the foundations for later on.
And how important do you see the establishment of the Confucius Institutes for this?
I don't think they're necessarily related, right? They predate these initiatives. And of course, they're a very important instrument for the Chinese soft power, and they have kind of significance that China is present, and that China is being appreciated, and that people engage with China. I don't see them as too important outside of this. I mean, of course, they do. I think they serve a good purpose of provision of Mandarin classes, which is something that's very deficient, I think, in Europe. There was a study by the German, or it was something that was publicized by the German Ministry of, I don't know if the Ministry of Education or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, you can check for yourself, but Europe in general has deficiency of Mandarin classes, and I think in that sense the Confucius Institutes have played an important role. When it comes to this other aspect and this criticism that they're instruments of propaganda, whatever, again, you have to look at what they do and what's their point. If telling the Chinese story from a Chinese perspective is propaganda, then you can blame them as propaganda. But then don't they have the right to tell the Chinese story their own way. I mean, that's the least they can do.
And from what I understand, you're originally from Macedonia.
I am from Macedonia. Yeah.
How does Macedonia fit into this story?
Well, Macedonia is considered by China as, it's a tiny country, but it's considered as interesting, to say the least, because because of its location, geographic location. So it's situated between two strategic partners of China, it's Greece and Serbia, and is on the route of the so-called Europe-China Land Sea Express. And as the other Balkan countries, it is still a very poor country with a very huge infrastructure gap and with a very huge need for more economic flows. And this is where China sees the potential for cooperation. But on the other hand, Macedonia has also had some turbulent past, not the least in the relations with China itself. In 2001, Macedonia had an episode where they recognized Taiwan, and it was in 2000 actually. And, the ties with China were severe. Then they were restored, but recently Macedonia had a very deep political crisis with the former government. A lot of allegations of grand corruption, including in some of the deals with China, which brought bad publicity. So it has been also a problematic partner for China, and therefore, China has not yet pushed for a deeper cooperation.
I mean, do you feel that's the reason why? In terms of Chinese investment, despite the 16+1, they've had a much greater focus on the Balkans, maybe with the landmark Peljasak Bridge, or in Western Europe with mergers such as Daimler and links with the London Yiwu express train, or the Rotterdam Chengdu link. Do you just feel that Central and Eastern Europe has been more neglected rather than out of design rather than accident?
If I get the question right, can you sum it up
The Balkans and Western Europe, economically and strategically, have been more important partners.
Then Central East Europe.
Do you see this as set to continue?
I think everyone matters in their own way. So Western Europe is very important for China because of, these acquisitions you mentioned, and it offers technology. It's like a very stable environment to invest, very prosperous. It's just business-wise, commercial-wise, it makes a lot of sense. The Balkans is very good for development projects, but I think Central Europe also is important because it's kind of a combination of both. So there is also some infrastructure needs here, and as it was exemplified by the Budapest Rail, there is room for China to come in. There is also interest in other routes, like linking Czech Republic to the Adriatic ports, I think, and in general north-south connections. So it's not that there is no infrastructure need. There is also potential for investments. There has been some mergers and acquisitions. For instance, Slovenia. I don't know if you count it as Balkan or Central European, but there was an announcement that Gorenje is going to be sold to a Chinese company. There have been examples of Central Europe as well. The problem, I think, is in the whole discourse on 16+1 is just the inflation of expectations. And I don't know if it's because of the Chinese discourse or just because that's the general mentality here to whatever it comes. People here, when the systems changed after 1989, the fall of communism, embracing liberal democracy, they sort of thought, okay, we're gonna now flourish. We're gonna have a surge of foreign capital, and so it's like investment has become kind of a combination of desire and belief and almost religious-like object. And after the global financial crisis, it was clear that there is a limit to what the West can provide to the region. So now probably they look to other partners. China itself inflated these expectations. Chinese always like to talk big, so I think they maybe were not aware that some of these things may be taken literally. But then again, I would say it's only 5-6 years since the cooperation exists, and that's a relatively small time for such a distant partner which had very little cooperation. So I think, I'm not sure what's going to happen next, but I think whatever is going to happen is something we cannot predict for now.
And although Russia was at first slightly opposed to the Belt and Road Initiative, it's increasingly been cooperating on multiple levels with China. Given the previous role of Russia in this region, do you think this partnership with China will result in a resurgence of influence, or is Russia clearly out of the picture?
Russia is a very interesting actor, especially when it comes to Chinese initiatives. Because, as you rightfully pointed, they saw Belt and Road with skepticism for a good reason, because some of the major projects of China in Central Asia could, and probably are already effectively resulting with displacing Russia, or at least, affecting Russia's position. And for sure, 16+1 is also China becoming ever more active in a region where, Russia may have some interests, and is at least the region that Russia is closely observing. I think there are two important things here when it comes to the Russia-China relationship, which kind of affect Russia's position. I would hypothesize, though, that Russia is not necessarily happy about the Chinese involvement in these regions. However, after the Ukraine events and the sanctions against Russia, didn't have much maneuvering space on the global stage. And it had to reorient itself towards China and Asia. So it was not a matter of choice. It was just convenient, and that's why I think they softened and eventually embraced. They softened their rhetoric and eventually embraced the Belt and Road. The other thing is division of labor, or just having different resources and different capabilities. What China wants to do on the global stage is something that Russia cannot afford to do. So Russia cannot afford to go out, take gigantic projects, provide investment, loans, aid, whatever. It just doesn't have the capacity. It doesn't have much to offer outside from energy, maybe military technology, which is very regulated, especially with sanctions and all that, and is definitely not towards provision of public goods and so on. So even if Russia had certain uncomfortable feeling about this, I'm not sure if there is or not, but even if they had objection, they couldn't do much about it. They couldn't compete, especially not at this point when they face unfavorable global conditions. So I think whatever the Russian position is, their capabilities at this point are very limited to act, and probably the easiest way is to go along with it, or at least not be too loud about it.
And how does the Belt and Road Initiative coexist with other sort of infrastructure initiatives, maybe the Juncker Plan?
Yeah, well, it's interesting, theoretically it could coexist pretty well, and there were statements about China contributing to the Juncker Plan. I actually have not been able to figure out what happened with that. There was an announcement that China would invest even a few years ago. I mean, theoretically there is a possibility to coexist, but what China is doing is increasingly seen as skeptical by the with skepticism by the EU. I think for now there is potential to discuss, and something can be figured out, but it's a matter of political will, if I may say so. Because, on one hand, there is, of course, European companies would feel kind of uncomfortable with China coming in on their turf. Like China even won recently in Croatia public tender for the bridge of Pilasac. There was a reaction by the European companies who lost out on the bid that the Chinese company was cheating and it was not fair, something like that. So it's a matter of competition economically. There are also concerns by the European Commission about certain normative issues. The Chinese way of doing business is not fitting the European rules most of the time, or it is believed so. there is also competition within Europe itself. China talks about building new routes, and even though these routes are part of trans-European corridors, the effect could be some people losing out. With Piraeus becoming a hub in the Mediterranean, the Europe-China Land Sea Express potentially taking hold, some different routes, maybe Northern Europe may lose significance. I don't know if this could happen, but it's, in the think tank circles is discussed as one potential line of thinking. So, people have issues with that. So, because, Europe, as one former commissioner put it at one meeting that he was in charge of DG Trade, he said something like, it's a coalition of competitors or something. So, there are always these interests. Yeah, I think at the end of the day, though, it's all about negotiation. So if you see increasingly Western companies joining Chinese-led projects, for instance, there were rumors of Siemens joining some of the railway projects.
I think they've just fully embraced it.
Siemens opened the Belt and Road Initiative. So, if European operators, logistics companies, whatever, Western European, start being included in these projects, I think that tensions would go down, and then we could see more serious discussion of complementarity. I think it's in the best interest of these countries and of the Balkan countries. If I may leave my academic hat on and put on my kind of concerned citizen hat on, the Balkans has serious infrastructure gap, and serious developmental needs. It's the poorest region in Europe, so it needs whatever capital it can attract. It needs whatever opportunities there. And for the Balkan countries, it's the best if it could be, for instance, the place where different global actors come together and join forces in something that can be a lasting public good.
And do you see it as likely that private capital can get involved in the Belt and Road Initiative? It's something that China has not really embraced as yet.
I think actually maybe they don't know how to embrace, but they really need, because it's a huge initiative and it's something that they also need whoever they can get on board. So I think there is a lot of opportunities for private capital, and I think they're trying to attract. Maybe they just haven't reached out to the right people yet, or there's still time. Maybe people are also waiting to see what happens. Again, with the latest shift in U.S. policy, whatever, everything is becoming kind of a strategic issue, and that increases the risk. So no one wants to be caught in a situation that can jeopardize their other projects. So.
And what do you see as the greatest challenge to BRI in the next 5 years?
Oh, the greatest challenge. There are many. I would say, though, the current restoration of kind of protectionist, mercantilist thinking in the West is an important obstacle for the Belt and Road. If there are more sanctions, tariffs, frictions, pressure exerted. Again, a lot of the Belt and Road countries are not part of the West. Actually, the majority are not. And within 16+1, you have 11 EU member states and 5 non-EU member states. But these are countries that really depend on the West. So any pressure, any friction on a European level will have a ramification, at least in this part. Central Asia, I'm not sure to the extent, but it would certainly have effect. What else? I think local issues, and it doesn't have to be war, just various forms of political instability and local competence, especially. I think with the Belt and Road, China also makes a wild bet. It's definitely putting their own fate also in the hands of others, not to a decisive level, but certainly, and all these projects really depend on local implementation, and this depends on local conditions, and there are various issues starting from corruption, tensions, even if you want natural disasters and coping with them. It's just the extent of it poses in various areas. There are various issues, and I think that is what's going to happen. Some projects may not live up to the expectations, some projects will succeed, but then that's the Chinese thinking. So, and this is where China differs from the West. For them it's completely normal that something will succeed, something will fail, something will become a model to follow, something will become a negative lesson learned. So maybe they can cope with this plurality of outcomes better than others could. And then what can be also a risk? That's about it. I mean, of course, Chinese economy running out of steam, eventual instabilities in China. A lot of SOEs are involved in the Belt and Road. SOEs are kind of very vulnerable point.
You don't see maybe some more surface level issues like corruption or maintenance.
Yeah, I think that goes to the competence part. That goes like building a project, maintaining a project. That's like local competence. Because even if you send all the Chinese workers abroad, like at the end of the day, you also need locals, and every place is different, and it doesn't have to be a systemic issue. It can be just human error, and take care of these things is like, this poses a challenge for China, because they don't want to get too involved. So, there's no interference, but then how do you, and this is something that I haven't figured out yet. I always try to figure out things, and I think this is like something that will be very difficult to figure out. So how do you take care of project that's outside of your country without interfering too much, especially if the project goes sour? And I think this will pose.
Do you think that's built into the design? I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but they said they expect 70% of projects to fail along the CPEC corridor, something like 50 to fail in Central Asia and 30 to fail in the Asian region. I mean, there certainly is the sort of capacity to failure built into the design of.
Yeah, as I said, that's how they think about things. And that's how China has. That's the Chinese development path. Some things will succeed, some things will fail.
To wrap up on that basis, if you were going to sum up the Belt and Road Initiative in one word, what is that word for you?
Dialectics. I think that's the word.